Tom Kelly Show. Anybody?
Oh, Al, I judge every guest on how the face they make when I play the theme song.
The Tom Kelly Show.
Oh, I don't know. I'm getting nervous. But here we go. Trigger warning. Spoiler alert. Success doesn't happen overnight. It happens in 30 short years. You are experiencing the Tom Kelly Show. I have a man on the show who I have known for years, who, if I were smarter about my career, I would have been trying to get to know better over the years, or kissing his ass better. He is the owner of one of the biggest comedy clubs in New York City, and at the time he owned more than one comedy club in New York City, or back when I was starting out, he owned more than one comedy club in New York City. And we're Facebook friends, and honestly, I love him as much on Facebook as a comedy club owner, because we have a lot in common. We're both from neighboring neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and he posts thoughtful things. And then, you know, he said he was doing a one-man show, and I'm like, geez, he had this book. I've never read this book. Let me read it. And the book is what I needed. For those of you new to the show, for those of you who are coming just for Al, the Tom Kelly Show is the podcast about me, Tom Kelly, one comedian owning his midlife crisis, reinventing his career after his career kind of fell apart after the pandemic. And now what you're kind of doing, if you're joining in now and you're hitting subscribe and follow and commenting now, is you're joining me on the ride up. And if you are a new comic, Al's book is a must read. In fact, my only regret about Al Martin's book is that I got it on audio and I didn't buy the printed version, because there were actually sentences I wanted to underline and write down. Then my second regret, I guess now I'm full of regrets on this book, Al. My second regret was I was listening in the car and I couldn't write down notes. But as a guy who's reinventing himself, I found Al's advice for people who are starting in comedy at the very bottom useful. And frankly, he said a lot of things about humility that I have long since forgotten and need to reintegrate into my life if I am starting my career over. Al, if you don't mind me getting right into the interview, the big thing that hit me was early in the book. Your career as a comedian, performer, and eventually comedy club owner started because you had a lie detector business that went out of business?
Yeah. So, yes. I really do relate, Tom, with what you're talking about in terms of reinventing. You know, I kind of learned during the pandemic that without owning comedy clubs, my game plan for life was a mess. I had no real backup plan because I had been doing what I was doing for so long. You know, like I'm sitting there going, okay, I'm 60 some odd years old. What the hell am I going to do now? I'm not quite ready to stop. And this pandemic has stopped me. Like, I started thinking in my head, what am I qualified to do? And I basically got reopened right around the time I was thinking maybe all I could do in life is be like an Uber driver or something, which, you know, you can make a good living doing that, but it's not the game plan I had.
You had, and it's funny, one of the things I wish I underlined or I'd wrote down, your golden rules for comedy. And the first one I found most valuable.
In general, in terms of golden rules of comedy, yeah, when your life falls apart, you know, you got to think of the other options out there before it falls apart. Like, if you see it falling apart, like from like the third week of the pandemic, when I saw this wasn't going to end quick, I started thinking, like, what am I going to do? And then, you know, then unemployment came along for the first time in my life. I was on unemployment, you know. So,
because you had an interesting story that what Ronald Reagan made lie detector, not just Ronald Reagan, but the government at that point in time. You had a thriving business. You were paying your bills, if not better than that. You had other people working for you, and then Reagan made lie detectors for job interviews illegal.
Right. So what happened was Ronald Reagan was a staunch advocate. This shows you how politics can change on a dime. he was a staunch advocate of the polygraph, and he had repeatedly vetoed bills that would call for it to be halted and not used anymore. Now, Ted Kennedy's constituency was very different than Ronald Reagan's. He relied on labor unions and things like that in order to get his votes and money. So Kennedy pushed the anti-polygraph legislation, and Reagan kept vetoing it till one day these two guys, I guess, got behind closed doors, and Reagan and Kennedy said, "What is it you really want passed in the Senate that we can't get passed?" And Reagan told them, and they struck a deal and made the polygraph business the sacrificial lamb. And Reagan was happy because he got something that Kennedy was blocking. Kennedy was happy because he got something that Reagan was blocking. And I wound up having to find a new career.
Let's go to that first reinvention. You get fired. Did you take a year to wander? Or you didn't get fired, but the polygraph stuff went under. Did you take to figure life out? What did you do?
So luckily, a company that I had worked for before I went into business in the polygraph and who had let me go had called me up, and they said they had gone through about 10 guys in my job in the ensuing 3 years since I had left, and none of them worked out. And they wanted to bring me back for a pretty good amount of money. I mean, a lot of money back then. And I figured I would never last on the job long term because it was an impossible situation to work at. But if I could last a year, if I lived at home with my folks and moved back in there and got rid of all my real big expenses, I might be able to bank a good chunk of change and then look for another business to buy into or go into.
So here are the things I loved. I mean, there's just morsels of wisdom that will hit throughout the episode. You talked about your ability to stay light. Expenses were low. You lived at home with your folks. So when you first got screwed over, it wasn't life shattering in some ways. Or comparatively.
Yes and no, because I did have, by then, I had my son. So I had child support obligations. Obviously, you want to put away for their braces and, other things that come along. So that was one aspect. I still had a car payment that I was making every month. So it wasn't the optimal situation, but yeah, it could, if I didn't have my parents' place to move back into and, save rent and stuff like that, it would have been a real disaster. But,
so let's go crazy here. So your first time doing stand-up, you were dating a girl who was like, I don't want to call her a bad stand-up comedian, but she had a bad night the night you saw her. And you gave her honest feedback. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, Tom, this is one of those things with women, when they're walking out the door and they ask you 600 times, how do I look? You look great. You look great. No, really, how do I look? You look great. So it's the same thing here. What do you think of my set? It was good. Really, what do you think of the set? It was really good. I didn't want to get into a fight over it.
20th time you crack and you gave one detail and it snowballed from there.
Oh yeah. I said, you know what? I gotta be honest. If you really want the honest, you really sucked. You were not good.
So, but then what was her line?
It was like the dam burst over. Her line was, she started cursing me, and then I was retorting back, and it was like a game of ranking, as we used to say in Brooklyn. We were ranking on each other, and we were going at it. And then finally she said, you know what? If you think it's so easy, which of course I never said it was easy, I just said she sucked. But she said, if it's that easy, you go on stage. So I said, okay. And, I started writing a little stuff out. And the following week, I went to Pip's Comedy Club
And I started at that open mic night in the early 2000s. That's a war zone. I mean, I might have caught it for the end of it. Was it Ray? It was, you were there before Ray Garvey, right?
Yes, I was there when the original owner's son, his name was Seth Schultz, was running the place, and may he rest in peace now. But it was a wild. You said it was a wild scene.
Now,
I was the only.
describe. How do we describe? It was a South Brooklyn comedy club when South Brooklyn, Sheepshead Bay, still had a large mob influence and a large Italian and Jewish influence. Now it's a very Russian Chinese neighborhood, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, a lot of Russians and a lot of Asian people, yes, but mostly Russians. And the second generation, you know what it is? Pip's timing was not good, because when they were there and the last days of Pip's, the Russian influence in the area, was mostly the people that came from Russia direct.
Yeah.
But the generation of Russians has been growing up, and they're Americanized. They've gone to American schools. They speak American language.
And for Americanized comedy, where Pips used to be.
What's that? Is there room for it now?
Like I did, like literally, I might have been there, and I have a funny Ray Garvey story for later. Long story short, Ray Garvey moved in. I was born in Brooklyn, raised out on Long Island. I lived on East 28th Street, in between the two owners of Brennan and Cars. The grandparents were on one side and Mr. Sullivan was on the other. And long story short, when the grandparents moved out right after we moved out, and Ray Garvey was good friends with a guy, Michael Sullivan, and rented from the Sullivans. And the deal was, when I felt I was good enough, Ray Garvey would start doing me favors at the Borgata. And by the time I felt good enough, he was sick, and I wasn't going to cash in on that while he was sick. But anyway, I won one round of their open mic contest in the summer of, let's make it 2000 or 2001. Had to be 2000. And long story short, though, I thought we were going to, and I went to the finals with a young Joey Gay, and
who wound up owning Pips for a brief period of time. Did you know that?
I heard that. I'm surprised it wouldn't work with him running it, or it was a different time in life, or he was also on his way to getting famous on Last Ending at that point, so he probably wasn't in it. But anyway, the long story short was, it was one of those things of, this is what you thought comedy felt like.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting room, to say the least. It was the only room I was ever in that the use of the N-word was encouraged by the MC.
And that's why I wasn't quite a fit for it. I mean, Joey Cola has a story where he made fun of a guy in the front, or a guy in the front wasn't laughing at his jokes, and a guy flashed his gun, opened the blazer and flashed that his gun was there, as if he was going to shoot him during a show.
It was a crazy.
And stuck with it. What was that like?
The first night was interesting. Because when I went on stage, by the time 3.5 hours had gone by, the audience was down, was just getting ready to leave. So who walks in? Andrew Dice Clay walks in. He's rehearsing for his HBO special. 1989 is the year, and he goes in and does 45 minutes, and he gets off at about 1:15 in the morning. And Seth Schultz runs on stage and introduces me. Didn't even remember my name, just said some fat guy who wants to do comedy. And the whole audience had left to go to the bar. If you remember, the bar was in the showroom, and Pip's in the back. And they're all talking to Dice. And there's 3 people left in the audience. The one is that girl who came with me, who by then was sleeping. So it was a nightmare, And in all of this craziness, I decide that I'm going to change an act that I've never done, because Dice walked in and I wanted to be dirty. So I was going to improvise a dirty set to get his attention. So in my delusional mind, if I got his attention, maybe he would take me on tour, So, so I listen. When I hear comics go off the rails with stupidity, I kind of can understand because here I was thinking I was going to impress Dice Clay my first time on stage. So he would take me on tour in the midst of him just rehearsing for his TV special. So,
Oh, how many of those fantasies have I had crushed over the years? But here's what I loved about that story is despite the show being a disaster on every describable level, you caught the bug.
I caught the bug because, I bitch about the 3.5 hour wait, but in that 3.5 hour wait, I got to talk to a lot of comedians. I went outside, I stretched my legs, and, we're all talking outside. And I said, you know what? I had nothing else going on at that point in my life, which goes back to that golden rule. So I had nothing else going on. I had no big relationship going on. Business was falling apart for me. So this band of misfits that I was talking to was probably right up my alley. I found them fascinating and I stuck with it. And, when I start doing something, I just I'm all in with it. I start going to open mics, find out the best open mics, read books, took a class, anything I could.
So what I found, we had Felicia Madison on the podcast, and I think she had a lot of advice that's useful for comedians and frankly, for my friends who aren't comedians who are listening to the show. What was useful for them was what I found you did and Felicia did is you sort of changed the playing field a bit. Like everybody talks about how we hate open mics and we hate bringer shows as comedians, which is the show where if I want to perform, I got to bring 10 friends.
Right.
You talked about how to be useful outside of being funny.
Yes. I mean, look,
just on shows perform, right?
Yeah. I mean, just to take for 1 second that you said a key comment, you have to bring 10 people. My philosophy about bringer shows has always been, if you can there are different types of people doing comedy. For instance, there's a guy who's a lawyer and his bucket list thing is to do stand-up comedy. He might not want to do it 10 times. He might only want to do it once in his life and cross it off his list. So that kind of person is not going to go through open mics 5 or 6 times a week and bomb in front of, they don't have the time. They're busy writing briefs for legal cases or whatever. So what I'm trying to say is the bringer show has a use for some people and is no use for others. So if it works for you, do them. If it doesn't work for you, nobody's putting a gun to your head to do a bringer show. And that's the real misconception of it.
Well, and taking it off of bringer shows and making it more of an allegory for things, whether it be a bringer show, whether it be an open mic, or whether it be your ability to draw asses into the chairs. Being funny is not enough. And again, I may be projecting myself into your book. Being funny just isn't enough. There's a lot of funny people out there. There's a lot of funny artists out there who just aren't quite famous. Being good looking isn't just enough. God knows that's the story of my life. It is about bringing value to the person providing you an opportunity is sort of, so what the book really reminded me of was just, listen, I had a great resume. Would people, I mean, I'm still useful. I show up on time. I'm funny. I'm reliable. And every now and again, a few extra people show up to see me if I give away the seats for free. But is that enough to keep the lights on at Bob's Comedy Club on 63rd Street? So what I found a useful piece of advice people don't give that you gave in your book for comics, which I think anybody can apply, is if you have a dream, you have to be useful to the gatekeeper.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to figure out, I figured it out early on, as I discussed in the book. I didn't have a lot of people to bring to a show at some point. Even if you do, at some point, it wears out, and you have to start to think of other methods. And what I try to find, and what I try to tell people, like every so often, I'm on the web and I see these. Somebody gets bored and they post, "Bringer shows should be destroyed and eliminated. They're a cancer to the world." Well, you know, unless you think a comedy club is a cancer to the world, you're actually pontificating for the destruction of the place that might be where you get discovered or get a lot of stage time. And what do I mean by that? The dirty little secret is a lot of clubs survive on produced shows, new talent shows, and all of these kind of things. So it's a mixture of that and their regular shows that gets them to the finish line every month to pay their rent. So when you're standing there pontificating, they're a cancer. Why are they a cancer to you if you don't do them? Don't do them. But don't deny this is what we have going on in our whole society.
I came up the barking ladder. I mean, it's funny. Like I've spent a few hours here trying to figure out why have I not crossed paths with you more? I think one was I never really went over to the East Side. Isn't that scary that you could have parallel lives and it's just, yeah, I was in Times Square while you were on the East Side, and then by the time you went to Times Square, I was doing enough. I was doing enough at the View, and then I think would throw me spots at that. Right. And it was just like, all right, I don't need the network somewhere else. I'm being watered over here. And I kind of missed out on a great scene you had there, because what I like about your clubs is they're not as, and I know you take shit for this. So let's see. And I want your answer. You're not as polished as Gotham. You're not as polished as Caroline's. There are real people, some comics who are newer, and then a lot of brilliant veterans who go in and a lot of tourists who go into your room. I guess that's what I found surprising about hearing your book was, does it hurt your feelings when you feel you're not up there next to the Comedy Cellar, even though, quite frankly, you've done more for more careers than maybe the Cellar has?
Yeah, I mean, the Cellar, if you look at their lineup today, other than the drop-ins of Chappelle and Chris Rock and those people, I mean, just their everyday lineup, a lot of those people, got their career started at my club. Right. There was a time that I did sit there and I said, why is this club getting all this attention? Why are they getting all this attention? And, I used to, it would really come out when a new club would open. Like, when Gotham opened, all these celebrities showed up there. It bothered me, like, why aren't they coming to my club? Why are they going there? And we have had our share of great celebrities. And I remember when I first opened and a lot of comics were coming to me, Silver Friedman, who owned the Improv at the time, was carrying on to people saying, why are all the young comedians going to that club there, New York Comedy Club? So right. I had my day of being annoying to other club owners, but I didn't even realize it at the time. And now I was the club owner being annoyed when everybody was paying attention to whatever new kid was on the block that month. And then I later found out the reason why a lot of these comics were showing up is the clubs were paying them huge amount of money just to get a little buzz going in the beginning.
That's it now. And that's a great point to restart. So here you are now, you're 61. You're a pretty big club owner. You've been instrumental in the careers of, I know Gaffigan may not be your top favorite, but you've made love with him. But that's a big name drop. Corey Kahaney. And then I'm trying to, you've had drop-ins from all these famous people. Oh, I want to get the Sarah Silverman story is brilliant. Is that okay to ask you that one?
Sure.
So Sarah Silverman does a guest spot at your club, and then it makes headlines. What happens?
Well, basically, she came in one night with Todd Barry. Todd Barry was booked on the show, and at the time, I think the spots were paying $50 or something like that. And she was with him. She wasn't booked on the show. And she said to me, when she saw the audience, how hot they were exploding. She goes, you mind if I can do a few minutes at time? And around that time, she was starting to get a little heat. I think she was on SNL. And I said, sure, no problem. Go up and do things. So then it's always that issue. Now, of course, I'm a lot more experienced, and I know when a millionaire comes in to do a guest spot, they're not looking for money. They're trying to work out on their material.
Right.
Sometimes it's be considered insulting over the $10. You know? But at the time, I didn't think of anything of it. I said, you know what? I'd love her to return again. So show some kind of gesture, right? You know. So I gave her $10. You know, and remember, in context, this is 20 years ago, and it was a guest spot.
For people who are not comedians, dude, I will work for $50 for a 10-minute spot in Times Square on a Saturday night. That is about, I think nowadays the rate is what, 75 or 100, right?
Yeah, correct. So, you know, so she goes out after her set. She comes out very happy. You know, they were great. They were great. And she goes outside. She starts talking to Todd Barry, and she must have, and I gave her the money on the way out. And she comes storming back in like 10 minutes later. What the hell is this? You gave Todd Barry $50. You gave me 10. And I said, you weren't even on the lineup. I gave you a couple of bucks of cab fare, you know, and you know, we were kind of like shouting at each other. And then she walks out. I don't hear anything about this. Fast forward 15 years later, someone calls me up and says, you got to see this. It's on TV. I look at it, and it's her talking on some show about the wage gap. She latched on to that cause, the wage gap between men and women, which is a noble cause. It's fine. But then she decides to make me her guinea pig, I guess, for lack of a better word, or poster boy.
But you were not the example.
Yeah, so she let me have it pretty good. And then, you know, I'm trying to think, like, how do I respond to this? Because my first impression was that the comics and the business is going to crucify me now, you know, without knowing the whole story. And the next day, believe this is so stupid, but it's what happened. I was playing a poker tournament with my wife in Florida, and I got knocked out of the tournament before she did. So I had time to kill. I went outside and lit a cigar. I was smoking a cigar, and I said to myself, you know what? The Brooklyn in me came out. I ain't letting her get away with this crap, you know? So I turned on my cell phone and I made my own video. I put it on the Broadway Comedy Club site, which had a lot of followers. I think I posted it on I paid for sponsored links on it, and
that's where
I'm going all out. And then what happened was,
or one of the first selfie reply videos, if you think about it.
Yeah, and then what happened was a writer for a conservative publication, online publication, saw it, and he asked to interview me. He interviewed me, and you know, I became my soldiers in that fight was the entire politics makes strange bedfellows. My allies in this fight was the entire conservative movement who hates Sarah Silverman.
And that's not quite you either.
Right. That's not quite me either. You know, I'm somewhere politically, I'm somewhere in the middle. You know, there are things one side does I like, there's things the other side does. And I have a lot of things to take into account when I think about I have to worry about transgendered rights, gay rights, which are not usually the conservative movements.
Actually, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I think there's something you did that was ahead of its time that you don't get. Your daughter, Dina, was your son, David, and Dina worked the front before, Dina was the first transgendered person I ever met, and it was normal there. You did shows that celebrated gay people before there were themed shows celebrating all gay lineups. You did all black lineups before people were doing all black lineups. You did all.
All Black Show was in '89. I remember, Tom, going to the Montreal Comedy Festival, and there was a panel discussion. Bud Friedman, Carrie Hoffman, who at that time owned Stand Up New York Comedy Club, and a number of other people. Carrie Hoffman got up to answer a question, and he goes, "There's some club in New York that is now doing all African American comedy shows. What do you feel about that?" You know, obviously he was referring to me. I guess he had no idea I was in the audience listening to this. And, you know, all the people on the panel concurrently said, we don't need those kind of shows. We need, you know, one show for everybody, and everybody could do a role on the show. And look at that today. The Improv itself does chocolate sundaes. That's what they call it, you know? So
maybe the branding on that one's a little tough, but you were ahead. Now, were you trying to be ahead of your time? I mean, I know the difference with your daughter is you loved your daughter, and that's just how it was.
No, you know, I went to Kingsborough Community College in Brooklyn, and a lot of people, you know, oh, that crappy school. Let me tell you something. I learned things in that school that, besides where to get good weed, you know, no, I learned a lot of things in that school as to how to market. I was a marketing major, and I that was the one class I did listen to, and it just said create markets where other people are not, and that's what I wound up doing with that show. And you know, nobody was doing that at the time. And then I said, well, this worked here. Why don't I try Latino shows and then gay shows? Here's the funny thing that came out. I did a gay show with this really sweet woman. Her name was Peggy Boyce. She's still around. She's still doing shows, producing them. And she produced a great gay show at New York Comedy Club when I owned it back then. And one day she said to me, Al, I really got bad news for you. I go, why? What's the bad news? And she goes, I can't do the show there anymore. And I go, why? She goes, because the powers that be want it in a gay-owned club. So
okay.
Now I'm the first one to do a gay show at a mainstream comedy club, and now I'm the bad guy, you know? So
Oh, that's the hard part about things going, I don't want to say too far. There's got to be a way to be inclusive where everybody feels like they're at the party. And I think sometimes we try so hard, we chase out, like I always say, liberals shoot their allies. And it makes me sad as a guy who is a Democrat.
right.
Democrat is sometimes Democrats, they shoot their own supporters, and that's a great example of that. Especially when you consider, especially when you consider just how accidentally ahead of the time you were, you know.
Yeah. Now everybody's doing these kind of shows, and you know, but
back in the old days, you're right. It was like we need a white guy, a black guy, a woman, and a guitar act. Show's over.
correct.
And we could and listen. And one of the double standards was we could have two white guys, but you can't have two guitar acts or two black guys. That was wrong. But now we're at a point where we have, you know, it's almost segregated to a point where I don't like Becky Donahue, who's been on the podcast, used to do these girl shows, girl power shows, but men felt very welcome there. You know, Becky was a lesbian, but not but I felt like I was welcome being a straight male. Like, and I feel like sometimes that's gone now, which is sad. But hang on, let me get to the meat of the podcast here, because I want to hit two things. You're doing your one-man show. You've turned your book into a one-man show. Why?
Well, to me, it was the next progression of the book. You know, a lot of times people write a book and then they turn it either into a play or a movie. So a screenplay was written about the book and has been completed. And we started the process of shopping it. And then, you know, the Screen Actors strike is hit. So nobody is making any commitments or investments right now without knowing when this strike ends. So hopefully that part will.
So here you are facing another challenge and pivoting, if you will.
Exactly. Pivoted, and I said, all right, can't do that. I need to take control myself. I'm the only one that's going to really have my interest at heart. So I contacted the guy who wrote the screenplay of the movie, and I said, listen, I was in Florida earlier this year, and I said, is there a way we can write out a screenplay, like a script for a one person, not a one, we started as a one person and then we added a few cast people to it. And then he called me back. He said, I thought about it. I think we can do it. And I said, can we do it in time for when I return back to New York, that we could squeeze out 3 or 4 shows, And he said, if you think you can do the audience, I can write it, no problem. So he went ahead, he did it. He helped with the casting.
How did it feel to perform it?
I hadn't realized how much I missed live performance. I started as a stand-up comic. And so when that feeling, you're a nervous wreck till you get on the stage. And it's like a roller coaster, right? You're slowly going up the roller coaster. You're now on stage, you make your first joke, and boom, you go, the ride starts, right? So if that first joke hits, you're on your way. And if that first joke doesn't, and
it hit, you're smiling.
I hit, I felt like the bowling pins went down, and I'm on my way, So,
so good. I got 2 more questions, and I'll let you get on with your day. By the way. Sure. Thank you for dealing with the technical difficulties of the show. Al watched me run around with my underwear, not my underwear, but running. I took my jacket off, started running around, dumping the Nicole Eggers show. Basically, I had the free up memory on the laptop. That's what happened.
It's not the glamour we all think it is, right, Tom?
It really isn't. I'm going to ask you 2 endings that are almost 2 different interviews. Let's start with the transforming your life one. Al Martin, 61 years old. You own the comedy club.
Oh, by the way, I'm 65.
Even worse. Al is 65. Al has owned blank number of comedy clubs in his life, still owns one big one, has other people managing it 6 months a year. Really, you're down in Florida for 6 months a year, right?
Right. Yet
there still is an urge to create and make money. What does the rest of Al Martin's life look like?
Well, I'm contemplating doing the show in Florida.
Okay.
And I'm contemplating possibly doing it in LA. Reason for Florida is most of the people left in my life that I know live in Florida. They've hit a certain age and they're moving to Florida. And LA, there's just a lot of people that remember and know me out there through the years that have moved out there that would love to see it. So, because they lived it, they were part of it. So,
there's a worth there.
Yeah. So I think the play, I am contemplating a book on food because that's another topic of mine that I thoroughly, as you can see, enjoy. So I might be writing a food book, and of course, waiting for somebody to come along and plunk down some money and let's get a movie made.
So at 65, it's about creating.
Still creating. I feel once you stop really creating in life, whether it's volunteer or whether that's the beginning of the brain starts to atrophy, and you don't want that. We need to keep alive and active.
Now, the second alternative ending is for any young comics who might be listening to the show. And frankly, guys in my stage, like, listen, I mean, I'm suddenly kissing Rich Brooks's ass for spots as if I were still 20 and working in the basement of Stand Up New York, telemarketing for him. But not just Rich, but I'm reminding people I'm alive and available. Right. What I liked about your book was it might be, if I've already taken 2 steps back, I may need to take 4 steps back to relaunch my career. And I got to get the humility for that. Somebody starting in comedy. I don't know if there's a new comic,
Well,
what would you say to them right now? Or
so
restarting, what would you say to them right now?
I'd love to take a second and answer both levels, your type of situation and the new comedian. So in your situation, if I was to be realistic about the career, I just don't think at a certain age, the traditional thing of, impressing an agent or a manager or a showrunner, that you've got what it takes to be in a sitcom is a bit of a longer shot at that point. Maybe a supporting role in a sitcom if somebody knows you and trusts you, but it's not likely at a certain age you're going to get a sitcom anymore. So now, if you said to me, Al, should I try to work the city clubs more? I don't see where the percentages are in it for you to do that, unless you have enough clubs where you can make, run from one club to another. Otherwise, okay, so let's say Broadway gives you a spot on a Saturday. All right, that might be good. You might want to invite some people,
Yeah.
maybe this, a chick you want to impress, let her see you on stage. But I don't think that's where Tom Kelly should be concentrating his efforts. Now, there are things that, with your background, having done warm up for a show, you're obviously someone that is probably can work kind of clean, and somebody that might be a perfect fit for something that makes a lot more money, corporate work, possibly colleges, although they're really a hard place to work nowadays with this cancel culture. But what about cruise ships? I mean, there's a lot of money in that, So
Yeah. No,
I wouldn't waste time trying to work in a Manhattan club at your stage of the game, but that's just my opinion. Now, for a younger person, just as I say in the book, find the path that works for you. If you're antisocial, you don't have any friends, and you can't do a bringer show, Al Martin's going to tell you right now, you can still make it as a stand-up comic. Yeah, go out there and bark a customer in. All right, you can't do that, then perhaps contact a club about interning, seating people for stage time. There are people that teach comedy classes that are always looking for an admin. So do that. Be an admin for someone's class, and they'll get you on stage. So, I mean, there's a lot of, you got to be innovative. You got to look at this as a business. And how do I go through the minefield of the business? Or you could be that person that sits in his living room and says, I'm a rebel. I'm talented. People, if they can't book me on my talent, then I'm not doing it, And you know what the club owners will say to you? Screw you. Who cares if you don't do it? Somebody else will, So I know that sounds cold and harsh and everything, but I'm from Brooklyn.
both are very, the first one is a piece of advice I'm kind of, I've been thinking on my own. So just so anybody listening, don't think my feelings were hurt. I think right now I'm going back to the basic of a Manhattan club just because I think that's where I started, but it's not where I want to wind up. And then the second piece of advice, which is useful to anybody in any business you're being creative in, is whatever your art is, you got to think of it as a business. Because what I love in the book is you say things that just sound mean when it comes from a Brooklyn accent, but are so accurate. Like, who's paying to turn on the lights in that building? Who's paying for the water? Who's paying for the heat? Who's paying the rent? And that comes from, it's not just all magical. You open a door and you perform and you're discovered, which I don't know if I ever quite had that delusion, but
what you're saying is correct. And that is why you see some people, digging Al Martin, and some people are not going to like him, because there are people out there that don't want to hear that kind of talk, but that's what's coming out of me,
A more polished person. I'll send you a link to her because I think you'd like her and you might like some of her class. It's all stuff but with more of a glitzy 21st century polish. There's a guy, Chris Winfield, and a woman, Jen Gottlieb. Jen's been on the podcast, But her way of saying things would be help one person every day. Whereas, listen, we are in the business of what can you do for me? You know, life is about what you can do for me. I mean, we pay for movie, you know, like I always say this with the people I love. Everybody I love in my life and spend time with provide me with some form of fulfillment or value. You know, like my parents love me. You know, my nephews visit my grandparents, so I love them. You know, I have relatives who provide friendship to people I love. So, I mean, life is, whether we admit it or not, we are transactional beings.
Right. And then I'm going to have to kind of go in a second. I'm noticing we're coming up on 12 o'clock. But one last quick thing I would say is, you know, for those that bitch and moan about bringer shows, nobody says you have to do them. But most importantly, you got to get that out of your head, because you will be a bringer your entire life.
Yeah.
Sebastian Maniscalco, you think places are going to book him for the thousands that they pay him if they didn't know he's bringing an audience?
Boom. Yeah. And then ending.
You will always bring.
It's about asses in chairs. Al, tell them where to put their ass in your chair for the club and your show.
September 9th, Did It on a Dare. How I Built a Comedy Empire in 30 Short Years. Tickets available. BroadwayComedyClub.com.
That's it, my friend. Listen, thank you guys for listening. New shows every Monday and Wednesday. Hit subscribe on whatever app you're consuming this on. Until next time, good night, New York. You just hit stop. Al, thank you. What is it?